Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. 6 weeks after the inauguration of the Israeli parliament, the 21st Knesset, it has surprisingly voted itself out of existence. This unprecedented move took place when outgoing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was blocked in his efforts to form a new coalition, and rather than let another candidate try his hand at forming an alternative government, orchestrated a bill to dissolve the Israeli legislator and hold snap national elections once again. To analyze the latest political developments and their implications for Israel's regional and global standing, we're joined here in the studio by Mr. Mitchell Barak, who is a CEO at Kevoon Global Research Group. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Gil Hoffman, who is a chief political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. Welcome. As well as Colonel in Reserve Miri Eisin, who is an Israeli public diplomacy, security, and intelligence expert at IDC Herzliya. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us an update on the lead up to and the current situation.
U.S. President Donald Trump has famously described himself as a stable genius. In Israel, we have almost 9 million geniuses, but the political system is anything but stable. To have 2 election campaigns within less than a year is unprecedented in the annals of Israeli politics and reflects some deep problems in the body politic here. Now, it seems as if Prime Minister Netanyahu has quite a sway over his own party, Likud, where nobody dared oppose his move to dissolve the Knesset, and his coalition partners who joined him, even though they each have their own interest in remaining and thriving under the present Knesset, which will be always remembered in Israel as the Knesset which never worked, never convened. We had in Israel some 70 years ago a military parade known as the parade who never paraded, because the jubilant masses blocked the streets out of joy. So this is not an occasion for joy, but nevertheless, come September, we are going to see whether Netanyahu's gamble paid off.
Mr. Barak, how do you perceive it?
Well, I think it's, to a certain extent, it's a failure of Netanyahu's leadership. He won the election day, but lost the election because he wasn't able to form a government, meaning that's a very significant thing. With an unprecedented number of seats, he had really 2 basic good options. One, to go with a right-of-center 65-person member of Knesset government, and the other is to join together with the Blue and White Party for a national unity government. First time in many, many years that was possible. He didn't do it. What I think is most significant, which took place in this whole process, is that Yair Lapid, one of the leaders of the Blue and White Party, actually said to the Likud, he said, let's make a national unity government, pick any member of Knesset. So that really paved the way for a mutiny. It's as if he gave the keys to the bounty, to the engine room of the bounty, to the Likud and said, why don't you start your own mutiny? And no one stepped forward then. I'm not convinced anyone will step forward now, but what we do know is that with the last 21st Knesset, that the Likud could have put together a government, just not with Netanyahu.
Colonel Eisin?
I'm looking at it in its regional sort of implications. Here we are, and it's the beginning of June. And as we look at it right now in and around in the Middle East, people look at what just happened. It isn't just a domestic Israeli event. What is this going to do to our neighbors nearby? What are Hamas going to do? What is Hezbollah going to do? And that's going to impact the elections in September. Again, because Netanyahu will be able to stand up and be the leader, that's one aspect, or Netanyahu is not giving security, that's another aspect. And now we have this interim time period. It's all about Netanyahu. He actually doesn't have any ministers left. He's the minister of this, the minister of that. So everything's on his back, success and failure.
Mr. Hoffman?
Netanyahu ran a campaign under the slogan, Likud strong and successful. Well, he can't do that anymore now because he initiated an election because he was weak and unsuccessful in his effort to build a government. How is he going to persuade the people that he can do that now? His image as being King Bibi, as being the magician who can accomplish anything in politics, has been forever tarnished. And perhaps we'll have an election where he may indeed finally be able to be beaten.
Well, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Oren, with regard to the first person you spoke about, President Donald Trump of the United States. When the snap election was announced, the president came out and said, out of frustration, that get a grip, start acting as if you don't really have the time to deal now with another election, because all this return to politics, if you will, because the political scene, of course, continued. But for the people at home, the election happened. They were done with it. Okay, let now the leaders deal with what we voted them into to deal with. This situation has completely changed now. With Prime Minister Netanyahu not being able to form this coalition, we see a prime minister vulnerable, as everybody has stated. But at the same time, he was able to orchestrate a situation where Finance Minister Moshe Kahlon merged into the Likud, basically preempting any attempt by Blue and White, his main rivals, to try and orchestrate their own coalition government, and leading Israel back into a snap election, an unprecedented move, never happened in Israel's history. To what degree can Netanyahu now come out and tell the regional powers, the global powers, I'm here to stay, I'm here to be able to lead the country of Israel into greener pastures, and the so-called deal of the century that was on the scale? We don't expect to have a government until that happens, so where is that at hand?
He cannot, because the only green pastures which he may see shortly will be out of his prison bars.
That's a strong statement.
Yes,
still allegations ongoing.
Yes, I'm talking about the perception among, you asked about regional leaders.
Indeed.
And they may look at the situation and assess his chances for survival, politically or legally, and ask themselves, why should we put our money on him if it looks as if he's going to be indicted? And once indicted, even though under Israeli law he could stay in office, is he going to? Now, usually what you have in politics is a succession of P's. You have party, platform, people who are voting for you, powers outside Israel, but personality is the overall factor here. And it almost never happened, I'll give you the exception in a moment, almost never happened in Israeli politics where a person, a leader, was anathema to other leaders. The only exception in 1965, Eshkol and Ben-Gurion, two rivals who couldn't cooperate in a coalition. But this was mild compared to what is happening now, when the question, are you going to join a government headed by someone who is one step short of indictment? Yes, not conviction, not jail. This is all far in the future. But are you going to sit in his government? And as Mitchell said, because of his personal problem, Likud had to choose between its leader and the party itself. Up to now, it chose to stick with the leader. Now,
because anybody who doesn't stick with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu found himself in the past several years either out of politics or entirely black in the opinion of the public. I'm talking specifically about the Likud party.
Yes, but it's not only that. There are parties such as Labour, where your leader's head is being chopped off within a year or two. This is their tradition. The tradition for Likud is the opposite. You never rebel against the leader. You accept his leadership. Only when the leader fails, let's talk about Shamir in 1992. Shamir has failed, lost the prime ministership to Rabin, then he resigned, and then Netanyahu won the election for party leader. But it doesn't happen, almost doesn't happen once a leader is in power. But the problem for Netanyahu is that the legal proceedings could even precede the elections. Because if he decides that he is not going to come to a hearing, which the Attorney General has set for himself for early October, 2 weeks after the elections, the indictment could be handed down even before the election. And that is going to change the situation. in the minds of the undecided voters, not his electoral base. His electoral base is going to stick with him come hell or high water.
Mr. Barak?
Well, I think that, the Likud voters are so programmed, and they almost have like a post-traumatic stress disorder from pre-1977 that Netanyahu plays on, that the country is being run by leftists, by people, the media is run by leftists, academia is run by leftists, and therefore, it doesn't matter what happens. We still have to vote in the right of center government. We still have to go with the Likud. It's the courts that are against us. It's the police that are concocting this whole case. And there are a lot of people that believe this.
Nevertheless, when we're talking about the Likud, the sector that you're speaking about, one of the key ingredients there is loyalty towards a certain leader. The perception of a strong leader who is capable of leading the state of Israel to greener pastures, as we earlier stated. And Netanyahu is still perceived as the only leader who can take Israel out of the mud of the Middle East and make Israel into a flourishing oasis.
Correct. But it's a little more than that. Israel is a Middle East democracy, and they love dictators. Israelis love dictators. And if you look at most of the parties in the Knesset and even in the government, they're not necessarily going through, and Netanyahu I'd call a benevolent dictator, but the other ones are, if you look at Lieberman's party, Kahlon's party, Blue and White Party, they don't have a democratic process within. Israelis love alpha males, people that can say, I decide, I'm the one that can do it, I decide everyone on the list. They're happy with that.
Colonel Eisen?
And here I am. Let's look at this Knesset that didn't come to be. Less women, more men, more religious. I have to say, as a woman right now, I'm kind of looking forward to see if in the next 3 months, us women, half the population of the state of Israel, will take note that we went backwards in the amount of women inside the Knesset, that in general, there are people out there who are putting out policies which are so not equal. I don't think that people will vote to the base in the same way. I disagree with both of you. And the reason, it's not most of them, most people will, but I think that there will be a little bit of a movement. Things happened over the last 6 weeks. The Prime Minister put his into the ground on a very specific aspect. And it wasn't about Iran, and it wasn't about Syria, and it wasn't about the peace process. And by the way, it wasn't about jobs. It wasn't about any of those different things. It was very much about, are you with me or against me on something very specific? People heard that. They may at the end on September 17th come back and say, and we don't care and we're going to do it again. But people heard that on all sides. I think that Israelis right now are very challenged. I want to hope that we hear some voices that come out of the events of these last few months, of the snap elections, of what goes on, of the fact that we are alpha males, of the fact that I sit here and I think of where do we go? Because I want us to be in a country where it's not just the democratic discourse, which is coming out on the side, and it was part of the campaign. Is that going to be the central aspect that it is right now? But really on how we look as a community, and I'm going to hope that not everybody's going to vote the same way.
Mr. Hoffman, I'd like to ask you, you've been at the snap election bill or the vote to dissolute the Knesset, and you've had the opportunity, obviously, also to talk to the different parties. To what degree do you think that the conscription bill, which was so spoken about, was the core issue of what resulted to today's reality? Or was there other issues at play behind the scenes that not too many people took note of?
That's a great question. You know, my headline on the cover of the newspaper the day that the last election was initiated on the 25th of December was elections are because of graft, not draft, because of criminal investigations, not because of the conscription bill. This time, people are saying, oh, it's really professional. Avigdor Lieberman did it because he had to save Israel. He had to make sure that the ultra-Orthodox would serve in the army. After all, while the ultra-Orthodox are only 10% of the Jewish population, they're 25% of first graders, and what happens 12 years from now, Israel will need those soldiers in the army. And so Lieberman, he really did it for entirely professional considerations. I have trouble believing that. I think that in the end, we're having an election because of one very strong word, and that word is hate. There is hatred between Netanyahu and Avigdor Lieberman. One wanted to harm the other politically. Avigdor Lieberman could not stand that Netanyahu is staying in office for so long. He wanted an opportunity to bring him down, and Netanyahu now wants to do the same thing to Lieberman. Netanyahu could have allowed the president, Reuven Rivlin, to ask somebody else to form a government. And probably no one else could have formed a government. And Netanyahu would have gotten another chance, according to the laws, without going to an election. But Netanyahu didn't let that happen, because between Netanyahu and Rivlin, there is hate. Their fathers hated each other. Their grandfathers hated each other. And the hatred between them cannot be underestimated. That's why we're going to have 6 million people have to vote again.
Nevertheless,
because
when
of
I spoke to
politics.
the chief negotiators, or some of the negotiators in Israel Beiteinu and the Likud, for that matter, I received a different picture from hate, necessarily, because Avigdor Lieberman is quite understanding that even though Israel is going back to election, Prime Minister designate Benjamin Netanyahu, or currently incumbent, is expected to win again the snap election, and Lieberman will once again be the kingmaker in his coalition. So to what degree do you think, with regard to the political landscape, did Lieberman view the current situation as politically incentivizing himself to go back to election and strengthening himself in additional sectors rather than just the Russian sector, which is his home base in Israel? Do you believe that this was more of an incentive to give him also credit among the general population in Israel and maybe other minority sectors?
Yes, I was at the victory party that Victor Lieberman declared for winning 5 seats in the Knesset. I didn't really understand why it was a victory party until he delivered his speech, where he declared victory over the media, over us, not over the potential political rivals. The media had written his obituary already, and he said, "I'm still here." And so I can understand that Lieberman now wants to build himself up as the secular right-wing hero, and perhaps another election will help bring that about.
I'd like to ask you, Mr. Barak, with regard to the polls, where does Netanyahu currently stand? Is there a shift in the landscape of the political Israeli scene?
One of the things I love about the media, it's like they're drug addicts. They, a lot of them, so many of them failed the last time with the polls, but now they just have an opportunity that already we saw more polls on Friday. The polls are, first of all, they're in general not long enough. They could be 1, 2, 3 questions. They use online panels, which are not as representative. And at the end of the day, even if they were the most comprehensive polls, which they're not, we're still 3.5 months away from an election. Meaning by the time we get to September 17th, no one is going to remember why this government fell. No one is going to remember what Lieberman did. No one is going to remember Netanyahu. We're going to be in some hyper thing going on in with regard to the election.
So you're saying all the people that I spoke to who voiced suddenly an apparent love and support for Lieberman for standing on principles will come to the election and forget in 3 months everything that they remember right now?
We don't even know who's running now, because the lists haven't closed. So we haven't seen groups of people that, have come together, that coalesce, people that are leaving politics, people that are joining other parties. We don't even know who the candidates are. So one of the mistakes, I think, of the members of Knesset was to think that they're going to come back exactly the same way with just a different number. The only thing I will add from what Gil Hoffman said, which I think was good with the hate and the personalities, is I used to work with the late pollster Arthur Finkelstein, talking about polls, and he had a great quote and said, and he worked with Netanyahu as early as 1996, and he said, the only people that hate Netanyahu are his friends.
Mr. Oren, taking us to the perception of the international community towards Israel. Obviously, Netanyahu received a lot of phone calls congratulating him for winning the previous election for the 21st parliament. Now the 22nd parliament is far from resolved, but he is still perceived as the next most likely candidate to win the election. Will this provide him, even though this period of uncertainty, will it still provide him enough strength to guarantee to various countries and also the economy for that matter, that there is here an ongoing process of the same government that is still even not entirely stable in the perception, but it is stable in the sense that he's still the leader that's going to be?
Well, we are still using this concept of victory at the polls, while what it means in this representative type of government is that one has a better chance than one's rivals to form a government. And we saw only last week that this perception doesn't always come true. So when you say Netanyahu will win the elections, it remains to be seen whether he can translate his what seems to be his chance for success, the fact that a majority of Knesset members recommended him as the designee to the president. Does that translate into the actual ability to have compromises between the various people who recommended him? Not necessarily, and his situation is going to be more difficult rather than less difficult a few months from now because of the legal problems, because Lieberman is now openly against him. Not necessarily that Lieberman will rule out any new combination with him. They had their ups and downs, more downs than ups.
Lieberman is very careful about not bashing Netanyahu frontally to the certain degree that he will rule out forming a next government with him.
Why should he close any option? It doesn't matter for him. His voters aren't clamoring for him to announce, to vow that he is not going to join Netanyahu no matter what, the way Labor voters or blue and white voters did.
Colonel Eisin, prior to the previous election, I actually cautioned here on the panel that we might find Israel into this limbo of holding elections one time after another because of the unclear makeup of the coalition, which was very concerning at the time. Unfortunately, my concern became a reality, and this reality is putting in front of us another situation. As Mr. Hoffman stated, we're seeing here a lot of hate between Lieberman and Netanyahu. If Netanyahu wins again and Lieberman is again the kingmaker, what guarantee do we have that the next time around it will work out?
We don't have any guarantees. However, in 3 months' time, State of Israel is going to be 3 months from now. We have a whole summer in front of us. Middle Eastern summers are hot on many different arenas. I think that that's going to impact what happens here in any case. Remember that Lieberman has done 2 positions under Netanyahu. He's been the Minister of Defense and he's been the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's not coming from outside. In that sense, he's coming from inside. He's touching on points which touch the Israeli public. I don't know if that's going to help him or not. But when I look in that sense to that idea of limbo, I'm going to use the worst analogy. Just like people become very tired of civil wars in the countries around us, and I hope we won't arrive at a civil war, at the end, we don't want another election, and yet we're going there. The people don't want another election. They're going to try a lot harder come September, October, November to put together a government, okay? And that's a negative way of putting it, but next time they'll put together a government. They won't allow it to go back to the people. I think that at the end, people are stupid once, stupid twice, just in that sense of we vote and we want to get somewhere, and the third time they will revenge in some way. So it doesn't give me hope per se. I don't see the numbers changing in a big way, but I do think that the compromises that they didn't make right now, both sides, both the Netanyahu side and the Lieberman side, assuming that the one is the kingmaker and the other one takes a large component, that will change come September.
Mr. Hoffman?
I sure hope Miri's right, because it's not fun covering 2 elections in the calendar year. And Netanyahu is about to pass David Ben-Gurion as the longest-serving prime minister, if you count the days that they've been prime minister, and that's a big accomplishment. But he has not yet beaten Ben-Gurion when it comes to the amount of terms. Ben-Gurion was prime minister for 8 terms, and perhaps what Netanyahu is doing right now in running for a 6th one, maybe he'll work in another 3 before the indictment comes, and that way you can pass him up.
Well, unfortunately, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so we'll take this opportunity to give each and every one of you the opportunity to not necessarily predict, but analyze where it may lead to. Mr. Oren, I'd like also to bring Israel into the picture. Will the political instability, to a certain degree, invite aggression from the side of Hamas or Hezbollah, for that matter?
It doesn't seem so, because if you look at it from the perspective of Hamas or Hezbollah, and they have a lot of open source intelligence. They don't have real deep coverage intelligence-wise of Israel. They don't have so many sources such as modern intelligence communities have. But they read the press, they watch what the leaders say, and they don't know whether Netanyahu will be as predictable as he used to be. And they are not going to goad him, to provoke him, for fear that in his despair, he may lash out at them.
Mr. Barak?
Well, I'll say the same thing I said before the last election. I don't know who's going to win, but I do know who's going to lose: the people of Israel.
And with regard to the number of people going to the polls, do you believe that it will be a decrease because people are just fed up? Or will there be an increase, as we heard Colonel Eisin say, that they will come because they want to have a definitive answer?
Now everyone is kind of depressed. They're tired. They're like, we're not going to come to the polls. Again, after the summer, people will have gone to Europe. They've been on vacation. Maybe they'll come back with new energy. The one wild card that I would mention is, let's see what the Israeli Arabs do. If they come out and vote to really teach the Israeli Jews a lesson, it's going to be really interesting.
Netanyahu's prediction from 4 years ago that they are being bused to the polls may come true this time around.
Colonel Eisin?
I'm going to wonder about the little parties that didn't pass the level. I'm going to wonder where those votes go to. That's going to come in and bite in different aspects. But I think that September, that in Israel, is right before the holidays, is right before the new year, in its own way, is a time when Israelis will come to the polls.
Mr. Hoffman?
We're told in Judaism that prophecy is reserved for fools. And as someone who has to cover the election for the next 100 days or so, I think I'm going to be wise and skip this one.
Well, a last point to you, Mr. Oren. To what degree is Israel right now in the situation where its political instability for the certain situation at hand is still strong enough to withstand Iranian pressures with the region warming up ahead of this hot summer?
It is strong enough because there is a national consensus in Israel regarding blocking any Iranian infringement on Israeli sovereignty. But there is not enough of a center here to support a peace plan.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Mr. Barak, Mr. Oren, Colonel Eisin, and Mr. Hoffman for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.